Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I wanted to take some time to talk about the state of Mythic Plus, which has been a bit of a hot topic over the past few weeks, from gearing to affixes to tuning and much more. I'm going to dive into the good and the bad of the current system, talk about changes we've seen over the course of Dragonflight, and offer up some potential solutions to some of the existing issues I and many others have actually seen with how Mythic Plus currently functions. I'm not pretending to have all the answers here for sure. There's just a lot of problems I have absolutely no idea how to solve either, so I just figured I'd weigh in on the topic, throw some things out there, and maybe, give Blizzard some ideas, or just compile a bunch of ideas that I've heard. So let's start with one of the bigger adjustments the Mythic Plus system got going into Dragonflight, and that is the introduction of a rotating dungeon pool from season to season. In my book, this is one of the biggest wins for Mythic Plus's expansion. I still, to this day, am not totally sure how we survived running the same 8 to 10 dungeons every season for 2 years. I will say it does still feel a bit weird how at the start of the expansion, you're not able to actually play through all 8 of the new Dragonflight dungeons in the first Mythic Plus season, but for the most part, I am happy with how the change to have 8 new dungeons every season has worked out. I'm not really sure how you would even fix that. It's a bit of a weird feeling, but I can get used to it, I guess, if I'm getting 8 new dungeons every season. Not really a big deal, I think. One thing I'd still like to see is the addition of more new dungeons within an expansion outside of just that one mega dungeon we get in the point 0.1 patch or 0.15 patch or whatever it is. It's always cool to get new thematic dungeons related to patch content. You go into a new place, get a new whole dungeon would be sick. And I believe in an interview somewhere it was stated that was actually a goal for them. Not 100% sure if that's true, but I believe it's true. Could be making that up, but still would love to see some new dungeons. Now, the rotating dungeon pool has brought some issues with it, and I think one of the bigger ones has been dungeon tuning. Now, I don't expect this to be perfect by any means, especially because there's just way less players testing the PTR compared to those playing on live, so things are going to fall through the cracks, but I think the frequency of tuning could certainly use some improvement, especially in seasons 2 and 3. Every single season so far this expansion, though, without fail, has had multiple dungeons that have been just severely overtuned, and while some of those have been clearly bugs and get fixed within a couple of weeks, there are others which remain that way for well over a month, sometimes longer. As a recent example, Murazon's Rise saw significant nerfs a week into the season, which just clearly weren't enough, and then it took another 2 months beyond that initial nerf before they received a second round of massive nerfs to actually bring it back in line, which, in my opinion, I mean, that's just way too long to leave a dungeon in an overtuned state. Personally, I'd much rather deal with an overtuned dungeon at the start of a patch than the same dungeon all expansion, right? That's not really a conversation, but just considering how WoW is definitely a more seasonal game over the past few years, if you wait 2 months to balance a dungeon, you've already going to have lost a bunch of players who, hit a wall and they're like, you know what, I'm done with this. I can't push higher, whatever, this dungeon's too hard. I'm unsubbing, or I'm just not playing WoW anymore. I'm done for the season. It's been 2 months, right? That's a long time for a lot of players. Kind of hand in hand with this tuning issue is the frustration of player feedback and potential issues that have been kind of brought up, either taking months to implement or being ignored entirely. There's been examples of this actually every single season so far. For example, in season 3, you can look at Waycrest Manor. The weekly rotation of witch spawns, the locations changing, and the actual witch itself that spawns there being different from run to run, or the Gorgers, who had a pretty common bug that existed all the way back in BFA where they would just ignore threat and punch random people. Both of these were reported multiple times during the PTR cycle and at the beginning of the season, but it took until MDI teams started complaining and getting extremely upset over these things for them to get fixed, or I guess attempted to be fixed, because I believe the Gorgers still do some weird things, and they had to nerf their melee damage to actually fix that problem. So in general, I guess I'd say that while the new seasonal dungeon rotation is good, I really like it, I would like to see more consistent dungeon tuning early on in the season, not just the first week or two, as well as improved communications on things like what they're potentially looking at, because maybe they were looking at these things and it was just too hard to implement it quickly, but it would just be nice to have a heads up like, hey, We do want to work on Gorgers, but this is a really weird bug, so we're taking some time to fix it, for example. Now, outside of the dungeon rotation, another big adjustment this expansion saw was in Season 2, where we saw some affixes removed, significantly adjusted, and added, including seasonal affixes no longer being a thing. This is kind of a mixed bag topic for me, so let's start with seasonals. Season 1's seasonal affix was Thundering, and that was the final seasonal affix we've had so far, which was not well received to say the least. It overlapped with multiple of the other weekly affixes or boss mechanics in very toxic ways. It happened way too often, and the damage gain from min-maxing this buff from the affix didn't even overcome the health boost it applied to the rest of the dungeon. So all in all, players did not like this affix. They were very vocal about it, and that results with the experimentation we've had from Blizzard with no seasonal affix in Season 2 and Season 3. Personally, I am a bit sad about this. Don't get me wrong. I did not like Thundering. I disliked it as much as anyone, but I think in general, seasonal affixes have been super interesting and fun to play with. They add some spice to the dungeon. I do understand the argument that with a rotating dungeon pool every season, you no longer need the extra complexity of a seasonal affix, as people already have to learn a lot with a new dungeon set every patch. But at the same time, I enjoyed, the raid theme tie-in, the kiss curse aspect of it often, and just I think seasonals are some of the best, most fun to play affixes they've ever made in World of Warcraft. Encrypted and Awakened were super interesting with how they allowed you to route through the dungeon. Shrouded and Tormented gave you a ton of personal power over a key, but also gave you some interesting choices in how you gained it, things like that. I totally get that bad seasonals can take away from a season, but in general, I think they actually have a pretty good track record, especially if you look at recent seasonals. Like you go back to like BFA Season 4, most of the seasonals there are decent to very, very good. I would love to see seasonals make a return in the future. I've got a couple of ideas for that, but first let's shift gears and talk weekly affixes. Quaking, Grievous, and Explosive have been removed. Incorporeal and Tangling Afflicted were added. Raging got entirely reworked, and then Spiteful Bolstering and Sanguine all saw significant nerfs. On top of this, the level at which affixes appear on Keystone was adjusted from 4 and 7 to 7 and 14, so much higher before you actually reach affixes on your Keystone. Overall, these changes did push all of these affixes into healthier direction, removing some of those toxic overlaps between affixes and dungeon mechanics like we talked about with Thundering, right? Quaking, very similar thing. Obviously, Explosive and any pulls that had a lot of smaller mobs, very, very toxic. So that really helped removing those and adjusting how things like bolstering worked, things like Sanguine, healing, not stacking, that kind of thing was very, very welcome. At the same time, though, we did see some of these introduced. Afflicted is a good example. You can have 2 of these spawn in a pull where maybe you have 2 debuffs going out on players, or maybe there's a boss that throws out magic debuffs on players. And yes, I understand there is the counterplay of being able to heal up the mob, but if this is also a high damage kind of output situation and the healer needs to focus on healing other people and not necessarily on the affix itself, it can be very overwhelming and comp restrictive, because all of a sudden now you need like 2, 3, 4 dispels available in your group. Then you have affixes just feel really, really bad to play with, and I think the reworked Raging is a great example of that. Not being able to CC mobs as counterplay just feels awful, especially when the only actual counterplay is Soothe, and you have only one single class in the game that brings an AoE Soothe in Evokers. So really what, you're going to get one target, but a lot of the pulls, there's 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 targets, which you'd be using CC on, and so it just feels really bad, especially on fort weeks when these abilities that you'd be stopping can just straight up one-shot you or nearly one-shot you, and then there's some additional environmental damage going out, right? I would love to see this affix adjusted. Maybe you can allow purges to also work against this, or something that I've heard been suggested is allowing CC to actually remove it entirely. So if you stun a mob that is in Raging, they don't get stunned, but the Raging is clear. That's been a really, really good suggestion that I've heard from other players, and I think that would make the affix just feel so much better to actually play around. And I think that's a very important point for a lot of affixes. They just aren't fun. They aren't something that feels good or rewarding to play around. No one logs in and sees that the weekly affixes are Bolstering or Sanguine and is like, oh man, I am super excited to jump into keys this week. If anything, it just makes people not want to play keys on a particularly bad week, which is something that desperately needs to be looked at and addressed. There are things actively reducing your player count on a week-to-week basis, and the consistent feedback has said these things aren't fun for years. And I'm not even an anti-affix advocate. I don't want you to remove all the affixes. I do like weekly kind of, not necessarily friction, but just the change up from week to week. But having things that are just unfun aren't fun to deal with. Like even the current version of bolstering, which no longer affects bosses, it no longer increases health of mobs, it has a duration now, and it increases the damage by a reduced amount. It still, after all these nerfs, doesn't feel good to play around, no matter how much you iterate or nerf it. They've tried to make it work. I think it's time to say that some of these affixes just can't be saved and need to go for the sake of fun. I would love to see them cook and play around a bit in Season 4 of Dragonflight with affixes. I know something that people have been throwing around is potentially reducing the number of rotating weekly affixes from 2 to 1. So instead of it being Incorporeal Spiteful Week, it's just Incorporeal Week, it's just Spiteful Week, which I think could be potentially really positive, right? It reduces some of that interplay, some of that kind of mental overload people face of having to deal with so many things at once. You've got all the dungeon mechanics to deal with, and then you have 2 affixes you're dealing with at the same time. Maybe this also kind of opens the door for the return of a seasonal affix if there's only 1 rotating affix, but again, maybe that's too much. Another idea I've heard is getting rid of fortified and tyrannical affixes, which are pretty boring, and they've existed since the release of Mythic Plus back in Legion years ago, but they do kind of still serve a purpose in changing up the gameplay from week to week, and instead, maybe they could add in these Kiss Curse affixes on a rotating bi-weekly basis, right? You could do something that still fulfills that goal of changing up gameplay, but isn't just a flat health or damage modifier. You could even reuse old seasonals here, right? Imagine a season where instead of it being fortified and tyrannical, it's instead rotating between encrypted and reaping, right? These still cause you to play dungeons differently from week to week, but it's a bit more interesting than just bosses have more health, trash has more health, does more damage, that kind of thing, right? On top of that, it really does maybe save you from having things like 6-minute boss fights. And I guess that's probably a good time to pivot away from affixes and instead talk a little bit about boss design and scaling in 5-man content, where I'm of the opinion that dungeon bosses, which last 5+ minutes, are just too long. These are not raid bosses with layered, complex mechanics designed for larger groups. They tend to be a lot simpler with only 1 or 2 mechanics, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Just don't make me fight it for a literal eternity. It's not fun. Now, I'm not going to act like this is an issue for every single boss. In fact, the vast majority of bosses don't have this issue, even on extremely high, like plus 30 tyrannical keys this season, right? Most bosses are still under 5 minutes. However, it does seem like a couple specific types of mechanics seem to consistently make these extremely long boss fights, and it's not really being counterbalanced by Blizzard. Timed intermission phases where the boss is either immune to damage or has a significant DR, frequent use of shields, or consistent spawns of high priority mobs that don't share health with the boss and need to be swapped to. These are kind of the 3 big things. Last boss in Halls of Infusion, huge offender of this, right? Exceptionally long intermission that was on a timer where you had to run through a gauntlet back to the boss arena and then kill some ads to spawn the boss. Iridicron in Galakron's Fall puts up massive shields, right? These last like 40+ seconds on the shield alone on higher key levels, all just so you can actually get to the point of doing damage to the boss again. Yalnu is another great example. A lot of people don't know this boss has a massive damage amp except for when the tree ad is alive. So the spawning of that mob is not only you moving damage from the boss to the ad because the ad needs to die so you don't actually get killed, but also the boss essentially has a massive DR up for as long as that mob remains alive. So it's kind of a double whammy there. And I'm not saying that these mechanics can't exist in Mythic Plus, or advocating for every boss to be the same cookie cutter template, but I think how these mechanics affect boss length needs to be considered when it's actually coming to tuning. Maybe it means you make the boss itself have a lot less health. Maybe you could experiment with capping totem or add HP on a certain key level. Maybe mechanics that add effective HP to the boss should be less frequent or tied to boss HP instead of on a timer. Whatever it takes for these bosses to not be something you're forced to fight for 6+ minutes at a time. Now, boss length aside, another tuning problem we've seen featured heavily in Season 3 is one-shots. Specifically, one-shots starting at a relatively low key level compared to what we're used to actually seeing, where timers are still extremely forgiving. So basically, Dungeons become less about damage output and more about who can survive the damage intake. Obviously, of course, Mythic Plus is infinitely scaling content. I am aware of that before the comments start spamming it. There's going to be some key level, no matter what tuning is, where you have 6+ minute boss fights, where you have one shots. That's not what I'm talking about here. I think what's important to emphasize is that in the case of Season 3, the key level at which one shot starts feels way too low compared to the actual key level cap. Right? You can start getting into 25s and 26s, and that's where the one shots start. That's where you start fearing for your life quite often. And that would probably be fine if keys were capping out only a couple levels higher than that. But instead, people are pushing 31s, 32s across the board. So there's this massive gap where the one shots start and where the actual highest key level possible is. This also has an impact on class diversity, because if survivability is such an important factor, even more so than damage sometimes, all of a sudden you're only going to start to bring classes that actually have enough defensive capabilities to live these like one shots that come out every 30 seconds, every 50 seconds, right? Now, there's been a conversation going on about defensive creep in World of Warcraft here. I'm not going to touch on that in this video, but there's definitely some great discussions out there on this topic if you're interested. I think in general, though, something does need to change on the scaling front. There are a couple potential solutions I've seen thrown around here. Just flat out reducing damage scaling specifically per key level would help make it so that one-shot barrier goes to a higher key level, hopefully bringing it more in line with health scaling so that the wall in a dungeon isn't just whether or not you can live, it's also whether or not you have the damage to get to the end. Also, as we discussed earlier, if Fortified and Tyrannical were actually replaced, that's an additional compounding source of damage and health scaling that would be removed. I've also seen it suggested that maybe certain abilities or even all damaging abilities should be capped at a certain key level. That one definitely seems a bit more extreme, but it's certainly an option. Also, not tuning related, but please just nuke RP in Mythic Plus from orbit. I cannot tell you how unfun it is in a 30-minute key to have a large portion of unskippable RP. Even if it's just 30 seconds that's accounted for in the timer, I would much rather you just take 30 seconds off the timer and cut that RP entirely. And this includes things like just empty walking, as you've seen in a lot of the Dodie dungeons, right? You just walk for minutes at a time. That sucks. That's not fun. Running across these massive empty platforms, like the random eel gauntlet, which they fire way too quickly and thrown at the tides where you have to wait every single time. Why? Waiting 30 seconds for a door to open in Blackrock Hold, right? The list goes on here, and it's, again, across seasons. These are just this season in particular. I just think they shouldn't be a thing in timed content, and I would be happy to take a decreased key timer for the removal of RP. Now, I do want to shift gears slightly here and talk a bit about classes. I know it's not really related to the Mythic Plus system itself, but I think it's a little bit relevant here. We touched on defensive capabilities and defensive creep slightly, but when it comes to damage shooting, I actually do think Blizzard has done a very solid job in general throughout Dragonflight. You had the one extreme hiccup with Augmentation Evokers coming out, but if you look at the current patch or any time before Augmentation Evokers came out, it's actually been some of the best class tuning in Mythic Plus. But when you start to look at utility, that's when you start to see a bit of a different story. And it's especially important when you look at how certain classes interact, or I guess don't interact, with not only the mobs and bosses in a dungeon, but also some of the affixes. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that utility is all that matters, or even that it's super, super important. At the end of the day, damage is king, surviving is secondary, and then you kind of see where your utility is at and fill in the gaps from there. That being said, some specs have significantly more going for them in a 5-man environment, and I'd love for some of the classes kind of suffering in this department to get some love going into the War Within. A great comparison to illustrate the massive differences here is you can look at Mage and Warrior. Mage brings a raid buff, they bring Bloodlust, they have 2 uncapped AoE stops, they've got a group defensive, they got single target and AoE long-term CC, they have an immunity, and they have a curse dispel. Warriors, on the other hand, they have a raid buff, they have an AoE stop that is either capped, which, why are AoE stops capped in the game at all? Or, if you want the uncapped AoE stop, it's in their extremely competitive cap zone area. Again, I know this is getting fixed more within, but this is how it's been all Dragonflight. They've got a weaker group CD on a longer cooldown actually as well, and they've got a single target stun. I think the big thing here is they have no reliable way to actually interact with either Incorporeal or Afflicted just by design, which feels really bad as a player. Again, I'm not saying massive differences between classes in the utility department is what's deciding who is meta, but it definitely makes it significantly harder for specs lacking here to show up unless they are literally the top 1 or 2 in terms of overall damage, and just kind of feels bad for players who play these specs on weeks that have affixes which you can't interact with, because you're basically just hoping someone else deals with it for you. You have no agency, you have nothing you can actually do. You're just sitting there watching the incorp, really like, I hope someone gets this incorp, otherwise I'm getting insanely debuffed. It also makes pugging a bit of a nightmare for these specs during those weeks. So let's actually talk about pugging a bit here. I think first and foremost, the group finder is in a bit of a rough spot when it comes to pugging, mostly in that you're capped at applying to 5 groups at once, which is a bit of a weird cap. It's very low. Obviously at the highest key levels, maybe there isn't even 5 groups to apply for, at least on NA servers. Maybe EU has, but even if you're doing like 24s, 25s, right? Of course, your weekly like 20s, there's way more than 5 groups available, and it kind of sucks when there's so many people applying the groups that you can only apply to 5 groups, especially when a lot of the time groups aren't even going to decline you if they don't want you, right? They'll just keep you in the list and see who else applies. So I think this is an easy fix. Just increase this number by a lot, at least double it, if not more. The other big thing for pugs is keystone depletion. You hear about it all the time. People ask how to get a higher score, how to push higher keys, and everyone just repeatedly screams, push your own key. But when you're putting together a group of strangers, it's basically a coin flip if things go well or not. And it definitely doesn't feel great putting your key in at risk, assuming all the risk in the group basically, and then other people are making mistakes or even just give up on a close key, leaving you with a key that's now multiple levels lower than you started, and now a massive hill to climb to actually get it back to a score key. There's been a couple suggestions on how to address this. I think a lot of them also overlap with solving another issue, which is the issue of homework keys. So for those that don't recognize the term, basically these are just keys that you have already timed that you need to do and either hope it turns into a score key, or it gives you the chance to re-roll the other keys you have in your bags and hope that one of those turns into a score key. This is much more common when you're in a 5-man like stack pushing together as opposed to pug groups, and it's something a lot of people don't enjoy doing, and it feels like the amount of times you do these homework keys versus actual push keys has been growing each patch. So what is the solution here? A common suggestion that I'm actually not really a big fan of is just making it so you can always run a key 1 level higher than you've timed it, and so keystones are really just there to help you skip some of those levels in certain dungeons. I think at first glance it does sound nice, but I think it creates another issue, making Mythic Plus on live servers feel a lot more like tournament realm keys, where you just kind of chain run the same key, usually doing some crazy stuff near the beginning until everything just kind of falls into place and works. In my opinion, I don't think it's going to be super fun. I'm sure some people do actually enjoy that style, but I think some relatively minor adjustments to keystone depletion and keystone re-rolling could actually go a long way here. For depletion, I really like the idea of keystone charges. So let's say you have a plus 25 Everbloom key. Instead of turning into a plus 24 on deplete, it turns into a cracked plus 25 Everbloom key, or, you know, a reduced energy or whatever it is. You lose a charge on this key. And then once you're actually out of charges, so you deplete this cracked key again, then it would go down to a 24 key, or maybe it loses another charge, depending on how many charges you want to actually put on the key. This doesn't 100% solve all the problems I mentioned, but it certainly lessens them, even if you only gave people 1 extra charge on a key, right? You could even opt to only have this happen on keys above level 20 if you don't want it to affect the entire keystone system, similar to how score for depleted keys above this level is drastically reduced. When it comes to re-rolling keys, currently the only option is if you time a key the same level or higher, you can then re-roll it, and this can definitely suck for pug players trying to push their own key again if they get a bad key from Vault, say, thrown to the tides in this season. I believe this topic was also covered on the Titanforge podcast recently, and they came up with some really great ideas. One option is to give players a certain number of free key rerolls on a weekly basis. Again, you could start this at 1, see how that feels, and you'd be able to just talk to the panda lady that reduces your keystone level, and instead you could say, hey, can you re-roll my key once a week, no strings attached? Another idea was an energy-based system. So basically completing Mythic Plus keys gives you some amount of energy, and then after, 5 or 10 or however many energy points, you would earn a key reroll. So this rewards you for doing content with key rerolls. Both of these methods help make rerolling a bit easier, and do so without giving you 100% free reign. And if combined with reduced punishment for depleting a key, I think it could make Mythic Plus as a whole, not just for pugs, not just for coordinated groups, just in general, feel a lot better. Now, I've talked about things for a while here about the dungeons themselves, but there's one very important thing I haven't touched on, and that is rewards. This is something I think Mythic Plus is currently severely lacking in, with absolutely no incentive to push past portals unless you're going for the 0.1% title, which, again, very big gap there, and very few players actually ever get it, 0.1% of them to be exact. I think there's a ton of easy wins you could throw in here as rewards, and you can use PvP as kind of a great example for some ideas. Instead of just getting a useless recolored ground mount every patch, you could add things like Mythic tier recolors for the current tier sets, weapon transmogs that look cool, maybe dragon riding skins, and I'm sure a bunch of other stuff that I haven't mentioned here, right? There's just a ton of cosmetic things you can add, the weapon enchant things, right? All of these rewards are things that aren't tied to player power, but would still get people excited and interested in pushing into higher keys where maybe they otherwise wouldn't, and that's just a good thing for the health of the game. When it comes to player power rewards, there's been quite a few discussions lately around the eye level of Mythic Plus rewards. Personally, I don't really have an issue here with how the system currently functions, with Hero Track being farmable and Myth Track being from the Great Vault, but I would maybe like to see the ability to turn Hero Track items into Myth Track items with some significant investment. So maybe you require like 12, so 2 full weeks worth of the Great Vault tokens or something like that to make this actually feel fair. But regardless, the reason for this is because when you have BIS items from Mythic Plus, let's say it's a trinket or a cantrip weapon, and like the Time Strike glaives as an example, right? The only way to actually get this on the Myth Track at max eye level is to luck into it in one of your vault slots out of like 80 plus options every season, right? Very likely, even if you're filling out 3 vault slots every week for the entire duration of the season, you will never see this item, and that just feels terrible. So having some item you can purchase with several weeks of Great Vault bad luck tokens basically helps to alleviate that. And it's not like it's a one-to-one trade, right? It's not like every week you're taking 6 tokens and you can change one Hero Track item to a Myth Track item, right? There needs to be some friction there for sure. But in this way as well, it kind of gets away from the problem Blizzard had, which was people just buying an item for free, right? You still have to earn the Hero Track item in this case, and then once you've earned it, you can then buy these tokens after several weeks, whatever, how many ever weeks you want to put it at, and then turn it into a Myth Track item. So there's a decent amount of investment required here. Crest, I think, could also use a bit of a boost, specifically Crest gain for alts here before people get mad. This feels really bad later in the season when you're trying to get a new alt geared up, and you're just looking, you're like, oh, I need like 500 plus crests here. We did see Blizzard recently remove the cap on crest, but this does literally nothing because the cap is already so high that you're never going to run into it. Crest becoming account wide is something people have suggested. They've thrown that out. I don't think Blizzard's a fan of this. They've mentioned they're not really interested in doing that. So an alternative that I would be pretty happy with is just a buff to crest acquisition, maybe on like the 0.5 patch when that comes out, similar to how the PvP gets a buff for Conquest, right? So this is just a flat aura that maybe it doubles the crest you gain from all forms of content, right? That would be very nice for alts. And again, you could put that out on the 0.5 patch. So that's less than halfway through a patch, but at the point where it's like, hey, I want to play an alt, you know, I'm kind of done with my main, but it sucks to get all these crests. So that would maybe be a good spot for it. Also, when we're talking about crest dropping, I really dislike that you get significantly less crests for not timing a key. This was supposed to be kind of an incentive to actually time your keys, but a lot of times it can lead to players who are farming crests to potentially maybe leave groups early on if there's mistakes because you get so many less crests. In the same vein, it can disincentivize players from doing high keys if they also need crest because it's just safer and more reliable to do like a plus 18 versus plus 24. Even if you are capable enough and interested and enjoy doing those higher keys, you just might as well do the lower keys so you don't miss out on crest. This crest system and the upgrade system in general have been super good for Mythic Plus, but again, just a couple minor adjustments here I can think of to make him feel a lot better. But there we go. I've ranted for a very long time here. Those are my thoughts, guys. I would love to hear what you guys think about Mythic Plus. Did I miss out on anything big here? Am I way off base? Do you have any other suggestions? Let me know down in the comments below. As always, thank you to my amazing patrons for the support. I could not keep making content without you, and I'll see everyone in the next video.